New class. This is a different class. Okay. And we started with this is an advanced person. And this is funny because I can give this problem to somebody who's very advanced and it always confuses them. Not always, almost always confuses them. So it's a really funny thing that it's a very simple thing, but it confuses even advanced people. Let's take a look at it. Okay, I gave him a sentence. I said, he paid her. First, let's look at two different sentences. Oh, we can't do it that way. Well, we'll go up and down. Okay, here's sentence number 1. He paid her. He paid her. That sounds like he paid her in conversation. He paid her. He paid her. Now let's look at another sentence, which is he paid for her. He paid for her. He paid for her. He paid for her. Do you agree that there's a difference between he paid her and he paid for her? Are those different ideas, or do they mean the same thing? They mean different things. They do mean different things. The first one, number 1, he paid her. That means that money was transferred. He transferred money to her. He gives money, she receives money. And but in number 2, he paid for her. Is she receiving money? Does she receive money? No. She's receiving something, but it isn't money. He's paying for something, and she's receiving that something. So it's very different. The difference between he paid her and he paid for her is very different. So my first point is that the word for is very important. It's very important to the idea of the sentence. Okay. Now, if I ask you, can you make a let's look at sentence number 1. He paid her. Can you make a who is receiving money question? Okay. Now this is tricky because we have two people. We have a person doing the action and we have a person receiving the action. And I want you to make a question, meaning who is receiving the money? You can see some visual help. You can see in number 1. Well, actually, I don't want you looking at the answers. Maybe I can move this down. You probably already saw it, but oh well. Let's try this. Okay, so you can see that the her is gray. Okay, so I want you to make a who question about her. How do you make that question? How do you say, who is receiving the money? Ask that question. Can you try that? Who did he pay? Because we have two who's, so it's a little tricky. Who did he pay? And the way that sounds in spoken English is who did he? Who did he pay? Who did he pay? Who did he? Who did he pay? Who did he pay? Who did he pay? Okay, let's bring that back up. Now this is an object question. An object question. Okay. That means who is receiving. We're asking who is receiving. But let's try another question. Let's try a subject question. Okay. So if you look in number 1, I've made her gray. Okay, because we're asking who's receiving. Now let's make a subject question. We're asking about who is performing the action. We know her, she is receiving. But who is doing the action? How do you make that question? How do you make a question where it's who is doing the action? Now, this is difficult for a lot of people. Even advanced people, they have a problem with this. But let's look at it. It's who paid her? Who paid her? Can you see the difference between number 1? Who did he pay? You make the typical, you follow the typical rules of making a question. You use the question form, and then you use who in the front of the sentence. But when you're making a subject question, the rules are different. You don't follow the typical pattern. You don't use the question form. What you do is you substitute. You just use who. You substitute who with, you substitute he with who. Who paid her? Who paid her? Who paid her? Who paid her? Now, let's try the same thing, but let's do that with our, using the preposition for. So let me just move this down. Okay, so now let's try the exact same thing, but we're adding the preposition for, which, remember, we said that's important. We said that it's important to use the word for. He paid for her. He paid for her. How would you make a who object question? Who is receiving the money, or who is receiving the benefit? Who? No, oh, by the way, this is a who for question. Let's do it like this. I'll give you a little hint. I'll give you a little help, okay? Whoops. This is a who for question. Who for? So how would you make that question? Who did he pay for? 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 That's very different from other languages. It's very unusual, very strange. And people are usually quite uncomfortable doing that. But this is the most typical way to ask this question. We have to use the word for, but it stays at the end of the sentence. Who did he pay for? Let me bring up the answer so you can see it written. Sometimes it helps to see it. Who did he pay for? Question form. Who did he pay for? But you leave for at the final part of the sentence. Okay, and now let's go back to the subject. How would you make the subject question with the same sentence? He paid for her. Now we want to know who is doing the action. So let me bring that up here. So we have he paid for her. How do you make a subject question with that idea? It's still the same, okay? When you're making a subject question, you follow a different rule. You just substitute the word he for who. Who paid for her? 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 Okay, now let's talk about one more thing before we do a little exercise. Let me see. I know I have this chart down here. I hope I have this chart. Okay, yeah, I have it down here. It's down at the bottom. Okay. Before we continue with the exercise, let's just talk about one little thing. Okay. Now we have this sentence, John paid Mary. John paid Mary. John paid Mary. If we substitute John and Mary in this sentence, we say he paid her. He paid her. Okay. Now, if we look at another sentence, Mary paid John. Mary paid John. And we substitute, we use the pronouns, it's she paid him. Let me ask you a question. Why in number 1 is Mary her? And why in number 2 is Mary she? What is the reason for that? Why is it that in number 1, John is he, but in number 2, John is him? Why? Because he and she have a receiving form. A receiving form. The receiving form for he is him, and the receiving form for she is her. Let's look at a list of the action form, the doing form, versus the receiving form. The doing form for a female is her. So she is the doing form, the action form, and her is the receiving form. The doing form for it is it, and the receiving form is it. That's easy. The same with you. Both forms are the same, you and you. So if you're doing the action, it's you, and if you're receiving, it's you. And then we have I, that's the doing form, I give, and the receiving form, give me. I want to receive, so I use me. And then we have the doing form for we give, but the receiving form is us, give us. Okay? And finally, we have they as the doing form, they give. But then if we talk about receiving, we have to say give them. Okay? Now, the word who also has a receiving form, and that is whom. Whom. So who gives, give to whom. Okay, so there's the doing form, who gives, and the receiving form, give to whom. Okay, but the problem is that whom is not very common in regular speech. Most people do not use that form when they're talking. Many people do not know how to use that form. They don't use that form, and they don't know how to use that form. So it's pretty formal English, and it's mostly just used in writing, or maybe when you're taking a test. It's good to know how to use this form. So before we do a little bit of an exercise, I don't know how much of an exercise we have here, but before we do that, let's just go back to the original idea of subject-object questions. So if you're going to use the word whom, that's going to always be about objects, receiving, all right? Now remember, when we asked who, oh wait, let's start with this one. If we go back to our original sentence, number one, he paid her, okay? Remember, when we made the who is receiving question, we said, who did he pay? Who did he pay? Who did he pay? Who did he pay? It's possible to also say, and more correct, considered more correct, to say whom. Whom did he pay? Whom did he pay? But most people don't talk like that. That's kind of formal, best used for writing more than speaking. You can talk like that, and people will say, oh, you have very fancy English. But most people don't. Now, when we get to using whom with a preposition, it's a little bit different. Okay, remember in our sentence, he paid for her. He paid for her. When we asked a who question, a who is receiving question, it was a who ... for question. But if you're going to use whom, you should carry the preposition over to the front. So if you want to use the word whom, you should say, for whom did he pay? For whom did he pay? That would be the best way to do that. For whom did he pay? For whom did he pay? For whom did he pay? Okay. So if you have a preposition with your object form, then you should carry the preposition over if you want to use whom. So you can either make a who ... for question, or you can say for whom ... Okay. Let's practice that. Let's practice using that. So this is I don't want you to see the answers if you're looking at the screen. So I'm just moving this down. So let's practice this with an example. And these will have phrasal verbs in them, okay? So our first sentence, try not to look, just listen. I want you to practice listening. So I'm going to say a sentence, and I want you to listen and try to repeat the sentence. They carried out the plans in spite of their competitor. They carried out the plans in spite of their competitor. Carried out the plans in spite of their competitor. Can you get that? They carried out the plans. They carried out the plans. They carried out the plans in spite of their competitor. They carried out the plans in spite of their competitor. Okay, we have this phrasal verb, which is carry out. Have you seen that phrasal verb before? Carry out. Carry out. That means implement or execute, make something happen. So if you're carrying out plans, that means that you are doing the plans. So first you make the plans, you write them down, but then there comes a time when you have to make the plans happen. You have to produce the idea. You have to execute the idea, implement the idea. And this is carry out. Carry out. They carried out the plans in spite of their competitor. They carried out the plans in spite of their competitor. Now, this is a separable phrasal verb. That means you can put the object inside the verb. How would you do that? How would that sound? Can you put the object inside the verb? They carried the plans out. They carried the plans out. They carried the plans out in spite of their competitor. They carried the plans out in spite of their competitor. Okay, now let's make a who object question. Okay, and so actually, this is going to be, I'll give you a little help here. Okay, this is going to be a who ... in spite of question. Let's see, can you see that? Who in spite of. Okay, remember we had like who ... for. This is going to be who ... in spite of. How would you make a who ... in spite of question? Who did they carry out? Who did they carry out the plans? Or who did they carry the plans out? Who did they carry the plans out in spite of? Who did they carry the plans out in spite of? Isn't that weird? That's it's very strange and very unnatural for most people who are learning English, but that would be the most typical way of asking the question. Okay, now let me show you another way of making that question, which probably will make you feel more comfortable, but isn't very typical. And that would be in spite of whom? In spite of whom? How would you make that question using the phrase in spite of whom? In spite of whom? In spite of whom did they? In spite of whom did they carry the plans out? Or in spite of whom did they carry out the plans? In spite of whom did they carry the plans out? In spite of whom did they carry the plans out? Okay, now let's change that. It's a kind of a simple exercise, but also at the same time, it's asking quite a bit of you. Okay, so there's more to this. Let's see. Let me move this up here. Let's change this to a reported speech question. Uh-oh, we're showing the answer here. I don't want you to see the answer. In other words, let's add the phrase, he asked us. He asked us. How would you change that? So I'm not going to explain it to you unless you ask, okay? So if you think the answer is strange, then please leave a comment and I will answer your question. Otherwise, I will assume that you know how to do this, okay? So, but I really want you to ask the question, like, I don't understand why you're doing this. Okay, so let me give you the answer. He asked us, in spite of whom they had carried out the plans. He asked us, in spite of whom they had carried out the plans. I've got to read the information here because it seems like he asked us in spite of whom they had carried out the plans or carried the plans out. He asked us, who did they carry out the plans in spite of? Okay, I'm not sure. Oh, okay. I'm just lost. But okay, now let's take that same. So if you don't have any questions about that, let's keep going. If you got that right. Did you get that right? He asked us in spite of whom they had carried the plans out. Or was it horribly wrong? That's pretty complicated, actually. So if you got that right, congratulations. If you didn't get it right, leave a comment and I will try to answer the question for you if you have any questions. But if you don't have any questions, and I don't see any, right now. Let's continue, and let's take that same sentence. They carried out the plans in spite of the competitor. Okay, they carried out the plans in spite of their competitor. And let's make a who subject question. Let's ask about who is doing the action. So we know it's in spite of the competitor, but we want to know who is carrying out the plans. How will you make that question? It follows different rules. Who carried out the plans? Who carried out the plans in spite of the competitor? Who carried out the plans in spite of the competitor? Now let's change that to reported speech. Wait a minute. I've already shown you the answer, but maybe you didn't see it. So let's add, he asked us again. He asked us who had carried out the plans in spite of the competitor. He asked us who had carried out the plans in spite of the competitor. Okay. Now, let's move on to a new problem. Let's see. So here's a new sentence. I'm going to say it. I'm not going to show you the sentence yet, because I want you to listen and try to repeat what I'm saying as best you can. Okay, so here is the sentence. Listen carefully and try to repeat. She's going to draw up a contract for the new client. She's going to draw up a contract for the new client. So that's just regular spoken English. What am I saying? She's going to draw up a contract for the new client. And there's a phrasal verb in here that maybe you don't know. She's going to draw up a contract for the new client. She's going to draw up a contract for the new client. I'll just say the first part. She's going to draw up. She's going to draw up. She's going to draw up. And remember, if you have questions or if you have doubts, please write in the chat so I can answer your question. I love it when you ask questions. She's going to draw up. She's going to draw up a contract. She's going to draw up a contract for the new client. I'm going to show you the sentence now. Whoops. Okay, let me move the answers down here. Okay, so do you know that phrasal verb draw up? Probably not. It's a pretty unusual phrasal verb. It's usually used in professional settings. Usually it means like making a diagram or making a chart, a very professional thing. So if a lawyer draws up a contract, it means like make a contract. But when you use draw up, I understand it takes a lot of skill, a lot of professional skill to make this thing. So an architect can draw up blueprints. You know, I can't do that. I can't draw up a contract. I don't know what I'm doing. Maybe somebody in IT could draw up, I don't know. I don't know too much about IT. But maybe somebody in IT could draw up a, I don't know, something complicated that other people can't do. Writing something complicated that other people can't do. So it can be a pretty handy phrase in professional environments. Draw up. She's going to draw up a contract for the new client. How would you make a who subject question? Okay, now there's some visual help for you because you can see that there are two who's in this sentence. There's the new client and there's she. So we want to make a who subject question. We want to know who is doing the action. How do you make that question? How do you ask that question? Here's the answer. I'll give you the answer. Okay, when you're making a who subject question, you don't have to really change anything. You just substitute the word who for the subject. Who is going to draw up Draw up a. Who's going to draw up a contract? Who's going to draw up a contract for the new client? Okay. Now let's make a they asked her. Let's do a reported speech situation. They asked her. They asked her. Okay, my student said they asked her would. I don't remember what we talked about with that, so let's ignore that. How would you say they asked her? Okay, well, when you're doing reported speech, you change the present to the past. So what we will say is they asked her who was going to draw up a contract for the new client. They asked her who was going to draw up a contract for the new client. Okay, now let's do this again. Let's take the same sentence. She's going to draw up a contract for the new client. But now let's make a who object question. So here's your help. If you look at the sentence on the screen, she's going to draw up a contract for the new client. We want to ask about the new client. We know she is doing the action, but we want to know who is receiving this benefit. How will you make that question? This will be a who for question. Let me just put that up here to help you. Who for? Who for? How would you make a who for question? Who for? Who for? Here's the answer. We'll do the answer. Who is she? Who is she? Who is she going to? Who is she gonna draw up? Who is she gonna draw up a new contract for? Who is she gonna draw up a new contract for? Okay, I know that seems weird. That seems unnatural and strange to you. That's the most common way of doing it, unfortunately. Okay, now probably you're more comfortable making a for whom question. You can do that, but it just sounds a little bit unnatural, a little bit formal, not very typical. Maybe in writing it would be good, but in spoken English, it would sound fancy. People will say, "Oh wow, you have very impressive English," but it isn't very natural these days to use use it this way. But how would you say for whom? Let's make the question with for whom. For whom is she? For whom is she going to? For whom is she going to draw up a contract? For whom is she going to draw up a contract? That's the answer. Let's put that up here so you can see it. For whom is she going to draw up a contract? Okay. And now let's make a reported speech question. Let's add, they asked her. They asked her. When you have reported speech, you change the simple present to past. They asked her for whom she was. They asked her for whom she was going to draw up a contract. I'll put that up here. Again, if there's something about this that confuses you, just ask, and I will be happy to explain it to you. They asked her for whom she was going to draw up a new contract. Okay, and then I think, well, actually, I think this is kind of the end. We never really finished the last part here, so I think this is probably where we will stop for today. Okay, so we had a great class. Thank you for everyone who stayed and watched until the end. I really appreciate it. Don't forget to press the like button. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel. And I will see you next time with more notes from my classes that I've done. Okay? Goodbye.